Welcome to A Stab in the Dark. I'm joined, of course, by Mike.
Of course.
And, of course, by Dave.
Of course.
And this is the show where every couple of weeks we go through a famous horror movie and we dissect it from start to finish and we look at the history and the production of it. And this week it may be one of the finest horror movies of all time. Nosferatu.
Coming out strong, okay.
Nosferatu, 1922.
Yes.
So I want to get your initial thoughts on this film. Nosferatu 1922. Go, Dave, Mike.
Dave, Mike. My new name. Double barrel.
Nosferatu 1922. Mike.
Right, so, I mean, I'm going to slightly go a bit negative because I think this is not as good as people say. I think it's a tremendous movie. It's very good. And it's very important for what it did for the horror genre and for vampire lore. But when I watch a classic movie, what I do is I compare it on three fronts. So the first front is comparing it to the movies surrounding it in that time frame, things that came out before and came out after. And I think The Phantom Carriage and Cabinet of Caligari are better than Nosferatu. And following it, I think The Man Who Laughs and what was my other one? Bear with The Unknown are better as well. And then my second point of comparison is the director's movies, F.W. Murnau's other movies. He directed Sunrise in 1927, which is an absolute masterpiece. It's one of the best silent movies of all time. That's better than it. And I prefer the book to the movie as well.
Oh.
But having said all that, it is a good movie. I just don't think it is as good as people say.
Okay. Dave, what about you?
Well, then, maybe I'm going to be a bit controversial then, because, well, as you know, this is an unofficial adaptation of Dracula.
And I'm going to say it's better than...
I prefer this to Dracula, yeah.
You've read the book?
Yes. A while ago, but yeah. I've seen plenty of the
I think there's definitely
well.
some things it does that I like more than what they did in the book. So, like the animalistic kind of nature of the beast and so on. We'll delve into
I guess we're going to get into it, but so, and you also mentioned, like, the contribution to vampiric lore.
Yep.
I guess we're going to get more into that as well, but I also like this film for that as well, and its particular, like, presentation of a vampire.
Yeah.
I really like.
I completely agree that there is the movie's biggest strengths.
Yeah.
But I think it has weaknesses surrounding it also.
So what are those two films you mentioned before, the ones that you say were before this?
Yes.
What are they? I've never heard of them.
Cabinet of Caligari is the more famous of the two. I forget the plot, but I just remember the vivid art style and the way it's directed. Because this movie, Nosferatu, makes some brilliant use of shadows that we're going to talk about, and there's some very interesting framing with arches and stuff. And in general, it is a very well-directed movie. But like the set design and everything about the visual presentation in Cabinet of Caligari knocks it out the park for me. And then The Phantom Carriage is a movie I watched about 2 weeks ago for the first time, so it's fresh in my mind. And it's a lot less of a horror movie than Nosferatu, but it's a lot more of a complete movie and a better movie. Maybe not a better horror movie, but a better movie, I would say. And that's about... like the lore within the movie basically is that the person that dies last in the year, so the person that dies closest to like the advent of New Year's Eve, at New Year's Day, becomes the driver of the Phantom Carriage. They become death and they have to collect people's souls for the next year until someone else dies closest to New Year's Day, which is a brilliant idea to start with. And then it's Christmas Carol-esque in that when you do that, you meet the previous death, and he runs you through how your life went, and it was, and the main character is like this horrible, alcoholic piece of garbage man, and that's part of where a lot of the horror comes from, anyway. Because for the 20s, it's quite dark. It's very dark for the 20s.
Is it also an expressionist film?
Well, it's Swedish. I'd say.
You say that like it's an answer. What the fuck does that mean?
That doesn't mean anything.
Expressionism was a big German movement, right, in the 20s. I don't think it was expressionist.
Well, expressionism is older than what the film industry did. It's
Yeah,
more
but
to do with
expressing it
arts.
cinematically was a lot more of
Yeah.
a German thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think of like early German expressionism in film when I think of this and Caligari, right? And like in terms of representations of expressionism, Caligari has this beat, right?
Yeah,
I do.
It's a lot more of a visual feast.
Yeah.
And it's a lot better at being an expressionist
So what
movie.
what is Caligari?
I don't remember the specific plot because I
Yeah.
haven't seen it in years. I just remember two things about it. One, I loved it, and two, it's Nicolas Cage's favorite movie. So
Well, that says everything to me.
that does
yeah.
say everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you love Cage more than I do. So.
Oh yeah.
However, he chose to adapt and talk about the filming of Nosferatu with his production company much later on, which was released in 2000 with Willem Dafoe,
Shadow of the Vampire.
which
Shadow of
is
the
which is
Vampire
a
is
Nick
very
Cage production company.
Oh, I
film.
didn't know
I
that.
didn't
Yeah.
know that,
Yeah.
Anyway,
What
Joe,
other
what did you
movies?
think of Nosferatu, Joe? We haven't got to that yet.
I love it. I started out not thinking too highly of it in a way. I wasn't quite sure. I was like, oh God, what am I watching?
As in the first part of the movie, not the first watch.
Your first watch.
My first watch.
Your whole first
My
watch,
whole
you
first
weren't-
watch, I
you
was
weren't
like, oh,
particularly-
I'm not so sure. So we should just explain off the bat that there's two real main versions we're going to be talking about. We're going to go into more detail with it later on.
Yeah, two versions of note, I should say.
Yeah, two
There is a
versions of note.
third
There's
version and there's a lot
countless.
of like pseudo versions
Yeah,
that are like.
I guess I was to get
bootleg.
into like the whole history of it. Then,
Yeah,
I guess,
which
right?
we
To
will.
explain- Yeah, okay.
But yeah, there's countless versions, but there's two real versions which we have looked into.
Two
and
versions
watched.
you can buy on Blu-ray.
In the
If you're-
UK, anyway,
yeah,
yeah.
if you're watching on the video, you can see that on this side we've got Eureka, and on the other side we've got the BFI. They've done some different things with it. BFI have, in a way, changed things, but they've kept it within a certain bounds. They haven't. In fact, they restored. There was the first version to restore the tinting, which is in the film,
Yep.
since its original release.
Yeah, which allegedly was something that Murnau always wanted in the movie. And
Yeah.
part of the reason it's in there is because a
It's
lot
like-
of the day scene.
Yeah, day for night, like classic
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
Yeah.
There's a particular scene when he's walking around with the coffin and you can
Oh
clearly
yeah,
see
yeah,
it in its daylight. Yeah.
So yeah, when I first watched it, this whole thing confused me. It nearly turned me off actually watching it, because I watched it on YouTube. I found a version that was like HD. This is good, but it hadn't had none of the tinting. So I actually went into it my first watch going, yeah, but he's in the daylight. Like this is all in daylight.
Oh, right, so that you had
that
that
was-
actually.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
like
that happened to me.
If you'll excuse the pun, it was clear as day.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, well done. And then, because you'd message in our group about this, and I was thinking, I'm not watching one of the official versions here. I'm watching a random version. So then I went on Reddit, looked at the stuff you looked at, and then I went on to BFI streaming website and on the Amazon Prime membership bit, and I did a 3 weeks trial of BFI on Amazon Prime. However, just to confuse matters even more,
Yeah, I watched this version first.
the BFI streaming website or through Amazon is
the
actually
UK at least.
in the UK is the Eureka
Yeah, the
version.
Masters
Yes.
of Cinema.
Yeah,
is it? Yeah.
so they don't even use their own version on that. So that confused me even more, because I was coming into it, I went, this has got this amazing soundtrack which is done specifically for this in a modern context.
Yeah.
And listening to the soundtrack when I did eventually watch the first version properly, which is the Eureka, or what's their other name?
Masters of Horror.
Masters of Horror.
Cinema.
Masters of Cinema,
Yeah, yeah.
or Eureka / Eureka, whatever.
Yeah.
When it did come to me watching that, I was a bit like, this soundtrack is fine. This music over it is fine, but it isn't.
I'm going to go ahead and say it's a bit, especially when compared with the BFI version, it's a bit weak. It's
Yeah, well, it
definitely
is.
It's
not
bad.
good.
It's goofy.
Yeah.
I think it's quite goofy.
It is
Yeah.
goofy
It's
in parts.
tonally,
Yeah.
somewhat tonally incorrect in some
Yeah.
areas,
Yeah,
I would
definitely.
say. Yeah.
And it doesn't really link in with what's actually happening on
and
the
it's
screen.
completely forgettable and unmemorable. Yeah. It's beige. It's
so
a big old beige soundtrack.
I was left with this sort of beige
feeling about
the whole film. And then I read a book as well on it recently. I read a book.
Did you bring?
Dissecting it.
you
I
did
brought it
bring
with
as
me,
a
yeah.
property,
Here it
Maybe
is.
Prop it up, can we?
There you go. Have a look there. Devil's Advocates, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror by Christina Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. I sound like
Just put on an accent. That doesn't make it okay.
it's like I'm saying that like Krusty the Clown on his Christmas special.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, there you go. So yeah, I read through that and I thought, oh, actually, this is quite impressive. Then I watched the BFI version when you lent me the Blu-ray, Dave, and it transformed the film for me. I ended up watching it and absolutely loving it, and I was honestly found parts of it spine-tingling. So when he's in the castle and he opens the door and he's in the hallway staring at him, that is one of my worst nightmares.
Oh, for sure.
If I go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and open the door into the hallway, that is my worst nightmare. That's when my brain goes into
It's a
this
brilliant visual, and it deserves a good soundtrack to go with
exactly.
it.
Not like a nice
some jubilant horns.
Yeah.
The spookiest of horns.
So after watching it on that second time, and it's becoming a bit of a theme with these movies we're covering, is I'm enjoying them more on the second watch. I actually love getting more in depth to them and finding out more about them because of that. And
I wonder if that's just a psychological thing, perhaps. Yeah.
Potentially, it took me a while. I've not really ever watched silent movies, silent cinema, and to come into
Is this your first silent film?
Potentially could be.
He was in The Artist, though, right?
No.
Oh, no.
No, I haven't.
That'd be kind of cheating, though. Anyway.
But this is proper silent cinema, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And then obviously when you start to dissect it and look at how it's actually filmed and expressionism, it leans towards what was my undergraduate degree, drama, because I think he actually did a drama degree himself.
Yeah, it's a completely different style of acting. It's silent movie acting. It has to be over the top. It has to be dramatic to the highest degree.
I guess like a lot of the actors are coming in from theatre, right? Like as well.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Although it depends. I don't really know much about the actors in Germany, but in Hollywood it was a lot of like laymen and relatively poorer people coming in, and like before the studio system really took off, that was their time to shine, and they got into movies and stuff. Didn't necessarily have to come from a theatrical background or anything.
Film acting at that time was kind of like nobody cared about that.
Nobody cared.
Theatre acting was
there was a long-standing prestige with theatre acting, and I would imagine in that time, if you were a theatre actor that went to movies, you'd probably be called a visionary now, but at the time you'd probably be thought of as like going for the cheap,
a loser, the
cheap thing, like doing a pantomime when you could be doing high art kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think going into the background and the history of something like this, it comes off. Well, there's not really anything before this in cinema, is there? This pretty new concept in the 1920s. I know a lot of films have been made, but it's still relatively new. So the people who are making the films and creating are actually people who've been inspired not by films, but by paintings and by other arts that have been around for generations and for hundreds and thousands of years,
right? Up until towards the end of that period, I would argue, but up until probably about 1925, it's the time of pioneers. It's the time where like pure invention drives these people. It's not necessarily influence. They haven't grown up around movies. They don't have favourite childhood movies. They don't have
there's no
movies that they're aping or trying.
There's no playbook, right? Everything is the first time.
There's not necessarily genres that they're trying to make their movie be a movie in that genre. It's a form of freedom that doesn't really exist right now. And hasn't existed for a long time.
So what did you make, Dave, of the plot in general? So if we're looking just at the film before we go more into the history of Nosferatu, then what do you make? Just like
my overall thoughts?
Your overall thoughts of the plot and how it pans out, and how maybe you guys know much more about Dracula and vampire lore than I do. How does it stack up in respect to, say, Christopher Lee's Dracula?
I mean, like I said just a few minutes ago, I do prefer this plot to the book. I mean, I don't think overall it's not very, very different.
I would argue it's very different. It's like an abridged, simplified version of the book.
It is more simplified.
It cuts out Lucy. It cuts out Van Helsing.
Changes the entire third act completely. Yeah. But the third act of Dracula is my least favorite part of it, and my favorite part of Dracula is the opening act of the book when he's traveling to Transylvania and like is spending those days.
Yeah, I would agree.
I do also.
I love the whole book, but I would argue that is the strongest.
I do also like the little mini. Wow, I do also like the little mini novel of like the captain's logs of the Demeter as well. They're kind of right in the middle of the book. But I tend to like lose interest towards the back half of the book. Really, when he actually travels to England and he's kind of young and sexy.
Why do you think that is?
I don't really know, to be honest with you. I think I just I like the Gothic setting a bit more than like a more contemporary setting, I suppose. There's for me like and to be clear, I like the book Dracula. I'm just comparing Dracula to the more like pared down version of Nosferatu. There's a lot more like kind of superfluous characters in the back half as well. There's like the three suitors of Lucy, right? Lucy herself.
But that's part and parcel of being a book, right? Like any adaptation of Dracula erases those minor characters.
Well, that's not true. No, that's not true. The Francis Ford Coppola one doesn't do that.
Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah, it keeps all three of the suitors.
Maybe I was too distracted by Keanu Reeves' accent. But
whoa.
Yeah,
he tried.
Haven't seen that one in a while. But okay, I stand corrected.
But
this is one of the only ones that erases Lucy and Van Helsing, that's for sure.
Yes. I don't particularly care about them erasing Lucy. I mean, I guess like because they're in Nosferatu, there's like a ship, right? They have a neighbor, right? That's a ship, right? And then his sister, who Ellen stays with while Hutter's going to.
Yeah.
And so
they're not really
the same character, but I kind of got the sense that like that was the sounding, just like the Professor Bulwer in Nosferatu was like the stand-in for Van Helsing, but they're not really the same.
They're minimised to the point of not really being.
But I find the omission of Van Helsing especially very interesting. I will have to check my notes probably, but it's very interesting.
You could take the point of view, which I think what you're doing is that they made it more horror, perhaps. They took away the threat. That is the threat to Dracula.
Yes, that is true. That is true. And like it's. I mean, Nosferatu. I've heard that it's it's like the early 20s, right? So like you had the Enlightenment in the late 1800s, and then they just gone through World War One, and there was kind of like this anti-Enlightenment kind of sentiment in cinema.
And that's why they wanted to erase this professor.
Yeah, they reduced like the influence of science, and it has this like knock-on effect of like making. There's a much bigger influence on like folklore, and especially the occult and Nosferatu. Count Orlok's kind of backstory reflects that, right? Like Dracula.
Yeah, he writes in the occult writing.
Yeah, like Knockian writing. Yeah,
he's kind of interconnected with disease and famine.
Yeah, and pestilence. But he's rats. Like he's said to be like essentially like the son of Belial, right? Like a demon. Basically. He's not human. Where Dracula was human, right? And had and had more human traits, whereas
but he was because of there's a huge amount of symbology for Christianity in the book that isn't in the movie. So he's arguably just as devilish and connected to Satanism and that kind of thing if he's offended by the cross, the crucifix, in the book as he is in the movie. Okay, he doesn't represent. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't like talking about like the loss of religion. I was talking specifically about the loss of like the rational. Because Van Helsing, like he uses religion as one of his tools, right? Like he's basically like a master of everything. And yes, like what you're saying is true.
But to the same extent, she does get the solution to a problem from a book.
Yeah,
in a scholarly manner, I guess.
Well, it's more like folklore. Like it's like a little like, like oral. It's basically like it's written down, but it's basically oral history, right, coming down to her, and it's not scientific. It's not the scientific method. It's literally just like a superstition. That
that is quite interesting.
I forgot what my original point was, but I think that's I think so. The reduction of the impact of science, the increased focus on folklore and the occult, which actually does have the knock-on effect of making it kind of more horror-y, which I also like. It has a knock-on effect on the like characterization of the Dracula character as well. It's much more animalistic, much more of an explicit monster, and
that is one of the elements I really do love.
Which, to be honest, like as I'm just talking now, but that like representation of vampires as more explicitly monster is my favorite representation of a vampire. I know that, and it's not very popular, right? Like that version of a vampire.
There's a lot more like Dracula adaptations,
sexy,
sexy,
human,
debonair,
like,
charismatic Dracula,
and that's fine. But it's just not my preferred.
I do
style.
agree that the movie's biggest positive over the book is the character of Dracula / Orlok himself, because that animalistic kind of monstrous visage and behaviour is a lot more horror-y, as I said, but it's a lot more threatening. I think it's a lot more modern than the kind of gothic Dracula character, which I do also love as well, but being as though I like a lot of trashy horror and I like my horror kind of brutal and bloody and in your face, that appeals to me. And I'm not saying it's a flaw in the original book, because I love the original book, and it may have been weaker for it if it was presented in the way in the movie. But in a visual, if it's a visual art form like the movie is, I think that's definitely a big strength.
It's actually a good point that I don't know how well Nosferatu, as it was presented in film, would translate to a book. Necessarily, I think it's the perfect.
Way of adapting.
Of adapting for that medium, in my opinion. And yes, it does play to my taste a little bit as well, like you say. Like it's more simplified and much more kind of straight horror-y, and so that does play to my taste. It's interesting that I think that this version of Nosferatu can only exist in a visual medium like a film, right?
Yeah.
Like you couldn't recreate it in words, and you couldn't recreate it like as a radio play or something, right? Like it has to be visual.
Because it's quite bare bones when you get to the nuts and bolts of actually what happens. It is literally like you've taken the novel and then just took out
like the essence,
huge amounts of it, and distilled it to basically like a like a horror story in a magazine, right? That's just built for scares. And there is a positive to that, I guess. And if I wasn't such a big proponent of the book, maybe I would be loving that. And if I hadn't read the book, I'd be like, well, you don't need that stuff. I just want the horror. But having read the book, I don't know. It feels like a weakness to me that they've took some of those things out. You can still maintain the horror, but still have some of this must have been presumed to be extraneous material in there.
To me, it seems as if you had everything that you love about Dracula in this silent movie. It wouldn't be the movie it is at all.
Correct.
It would be a convoluted mess on silent film, I feel. Like the simplification of it, to me, is a good thing. I like things to be convoluted. Don't get me wrong.
But you can tell a complex story in a silent film. It's just more difficult to do. And his other movie, Sunrise, did do that, so Murnau can do that.
But it doesn't need to be.
A choice. No,
he doesn't need to do that within this film. Like, it's something very simple, but very effective. He uses an animal, basically. That's who Orlok is. He's an animal. And he gets compared so much to animals. His teeth, instead of having the fangs, he's got these two like rat-like teeth at the front. So he's rat-like, plague-ridden. You've got the werewolf, which is actually a cheetah, I believe, or something like that. When
it's a hyena.
A hyena, sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah. So the hyena, you've got that. So animals play a massive part, and then you've got the character Nock.
Oh, Nock, yeah.
Who is very animalistic in his own way. He's almost that little rat slug type personality.
Yeah.
He's off-putting.
Yeah, he's the analogue of Renfield in the book, who is like pretty much exactly the same as that in the book.
Yeah, that's another improvement, another streamlining, because it's two characters, right? Like it's Harker's boss and Renfield. Like they're not the same character in the book.
But I like this.
Yeah,
that it is streamlined. It's very, because
for me there was always a question. I mean, not a big question, because I think you can kind of read between the lines. But like, you know, how. Because in the book, Renfield is just an insane guy, right? That one of Lucy's suitors, who's a doctor and works at the insane asylum, is like, it's his patient. But there's no, from what I can recall, like no explicit like mention of how they even got in contact, how he got in contact with Dracula in the first place in order to become crazy.
Yeah, but we don't get that in the movie either. He's already familiar with him, and he reads the occult symbols. Unless you're insinuating that reading the occult symbols. Is
No. I think that because we're explicitly shown that he is reading those occult symbols, and it also makes sense within the context of like the plot for them to be corresponding before he assigns Hutter the task of like finding the property for Orlok.
Yeah,
and I think that just the fact that we see Nock reading those symbols, and for me explicitly tells me that they've been communicating for a while, such that they can communicate in this Nockian language, and it just kind of streamlines the whole thing. I wouldn't say that Renfield was like necessarily a weakness. I just find it just much more streamlined.
Yeah. I think like the difference is basically we're looking at the same differences and we're just flip sides of the coin of it, because you're using the word streamlining whereas I would use the word simplifying. One's positive.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say simplification is necessarily a negative way of saying something about this film.
No, but it's not necessarily positive either.
Not to you, but simplification in other areas can be a positive thing.
I like a simple movie to an extent, but I don't know, because I like the whole Dracula. Well, I don't know. I'm okay with things doing things differently, but in this particular case, I'm not sure of some of the changes. I love some of the changes, but I'm not sure of some of the others.
In a way that I put it to you that perhaps this movie is more a movie of moments, because it's harder to go plot by plot point like we have done in past episodes, because it is quite simple and the story is very well known.
See, now we're going back to the minimalism, right, of Azrael and Mad Max Fury Road.
When we did the
minimalistic plots are not really the kind of thing that I vibe with so well.
Yeah.
So maybe this is another example of me doing just that.
No, potentially, but it is a movie for me of fantastic moments. It's like WrestleMania. Okay.
At least he wasn't Doctor Who.
It's interesting.
It's like WrestleMania. Everyone in WrestleMania, rather than a good match, wants a moment, and which will live on forever. And I think over most of the films you've mentioned, over Nosferatu, this has the moment.
This is a lot more famous than those ones there. There's very, very memorable scenes in those other ones.
Well, I'm not saying that. However, I've seen some of these because of just how famous Nosferatu is. Someone outside of the realm of watching vampire stuff like you has seen this. I've seen growing up him rising out of the coffin without bending. Like I've seen
the
that.
Shadowed fingers.
The shadow fingers.
His
coming into the bedroom with
the archer.
With
which
the
I
archer.
should clarify are amazing shots and some of the most
all-time most iconic shots.
Most iconic and brilliant shots of all time. Yeah.
So perhaps
and I'm not arguing with those being brilliant. I'm just arguing about the substance once again.
But there's nothing wrong with that, though, to me. There's nothing wrong with having a simplistic story. Like, sometimes not everything needs to be part of a bigger, wider, more convoluted, interweave story. To me, if you just tell a good story in a simple way, but how effective it is down to the direction and the way the plot points are on the book, and when they actually do it, and when you look into it, you find that they did things on the fly as well. They, in some of the scenes they filmed, they'll go, "Oh, that castle looks good. Let's use that at the end." As like his castle with his death has become the destruction of the castle. That happened when they did the raft scene. And they filmed that. So for me, it's just like, it's artistic brilliance. There's something avant-garde, very 1920s, very bohemian within the context of what Germany was like. Berlin at that time was this place of sex and culture and the underground. In fact, famously,
the Weimar Republic.
Hitler famously hated Berlin at the time. He was much more Munich, and he wanted the rest of Germany to be more like that, and less of this bohemian homoeroticism, the sex and the drugs and everything that went with it.
Just freedom.
Freedom and artistic freedom at this point that happened after such a dreadful war, and then a plague of sorts, a pandemic. And you can see that within this film. When you look into this film, you see those threads of what has happened in the world and in Germany specifically.
Yeah, it's quite clear that the foreign invasion and disease are basically the two main scary themes used in this movie.
And in a sense...
and they're used because of the time that the movie was made and the place that the movie was made.
But to me, that almost... Nosferatu is almost timeless in that sense because, yeah, we get the fact that people go absolutely stir crazy and are looking for a scapegoat. Like Nock is a scapegoat in this one for the plague, and they run after him. Like, we did this stuff in COVID. Like, we got together in groups, and things that wouldn't normally happen during that time frame.
Yeah, I would never argue it didn't have universal themes, because nobody would be talking about it now if it didn't have universal themes. The only reason this movie, and any movie from that time period, survives is because of the universal themes and the stark, iconic imagery. And all of that is without fault. That's what makes this a great movie. That's what makes this a movie that's lasted for
over
102 years now. Yeah.
But to me, it's quite a haunting movie as well. You look at the how death was so prevalent, if I can say the word, in that time.
Prevalent.
How death was so I can't say it. Prevalent in that time period.
Cromulent.
Yeah, that's easy for me to say. So when looking through it all, so 10 million soldiers died in World War One, right? Overall, Germany lost 2 million, and a further 4.2 million came home with mental and physical disabilities, scars. Terrible, terrible for the time. And that actually also meant that it's something like 19% of the German population were injured or killed in that time. And then you get the bloody Spanish flu that came straight after that and killed countless others. And so you can see this almost generation.
And you got the hyperinflation, right? Was that before 1922?
Hyperinflation came after 1918 when the Allies...
Right, so yeah, that is before Nosferatu then.
Yeah, the Allies put terms on Germany which were unjust. And they made them pay back millions and millions of pounds or whatever they used to use.
There's all kinds of weird shit on that document, by the way, if you ever read that.
Really?
There's like you've got to return the bones of this person to this place and stuff, because it was like an open forum for anyone to air their grievances from the last 100 years. So there's huge amounts of weird stuff on there. Yeah, but carry on.
Yeah, but no, it's a huge upheave of everything.
It's like Germany's down. Let's get everything we want out of it.
And you've lost the Kaiser at this point as well. They're gone and replaced by something more of a president type figure. Chancellor, yeah. So you have all of this happening before this film is out, and to me, you can see this within the film. You can see this actually, I think, with Orlok. Although he is animalistic and not attractive in the slightest, there's a sexual magnetism, right, I find, of the character with Ellen, With Ellen.
Well, there's a power that he holds over women, which is something from the books.
Yeah.
But they didn't keep the visual aspect of that. Yeah.
But I think you could argue that the sexual chemistry between those two is much more than with Hutter and Ellen.
Yeah, I think that the sexuality of the film is actually quite downplayed compared to most Dracula representations, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I find it much more kind of animalistic and...
Yeah, definitely.
And not... Because I don't find him to be so human in that way.
I think he's supposed to be entirely removed from humanity as much as possible. Mm-hmm. It's definitely night and day to Christopher Lee's Dracula, or the guy that played him in the 1979 one. Can't remember the name of. But usually it's a quite sexy man with lovely hair and lovely suit, and he's just got a lovely voice and he's a lovely man. And they're attracted to him for that reason. But I think he does it could be part of a trickery to get him to take the blood. So maybe it isn't, but maybe it is. Maybe he does have some kind of power over ultimately she does want him to take her blood to sacrifice herself for him to die.
Yeah, but that does imply that she has autonomy, right? That he doesn't have power over her.
Yeah.
Or that she has power over him, actually, right?
But that whole scene...
Maybe it's meant as an inversion, perhaps.
I would say, in a way, that whole scene is quite sexual. When she invites him in by opening the windows, she presents her neck, she presents her breasts to him, basically. It's that the neck
but
is
she is doing
instead
that
of
in favour of his demise.
Absolutely, she is, but it's sexual. There's still a sexual thing. And even when he is on the other side, the famous bit where he's like got like that and he just stares and then walks out of the abandoned warehouse. He is staring. To me, there's almost this animalistic sexual something going on between the two characters, right? And then when he comes in, she lays herself down on the bed, and then he then goes to her neck, which he finds the most sexually attractive, the most attractive part of her.
Sexuality is just a hunger, isn't it?
And the blood
lust is a form of hunger.
Yeah. I think it's actually not.
Analogous
it's not his sexuality; it's her sexuality, right? He has no sexuality, no sexual power over her. She controls him. He's obsessed with her,
and that's his downfall.
And that's his right. Which actually was also kind of interesting when you look at the representation of vampires that followed. Very rare, right? Or if ever, is it their sexual appetite?
Yeah, that is a rarity.
That defeats them. I don't recall if it's...
And that is interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That is quite a good change, I would say.
I don't recall. I think it was actually the... Incidentally, I watched for the first time the remake of Nosferatu, the 1979 one.
I saw it a long time ago.
Yeah, directed by...
I remember it being ridiculously well shot.
Directed by Werner Herzog. So they have Klaus Kinski playing Orlok. They have, I think her name Isabelle Adjani, who's the lead in Possession. She's Ellen. Actually, no, she's Lucy, because they change. They use the names from the novel.
A lot of prints of this movie did there. That's what got them in trouble.
Yeah.
Like bootleg prints.
Sorry. My original point was firstly that remake is amazing. It's easily my favorite Dracula film. Not close. I would highly recommend.
It's an improvement on the 22, you think, version?
Yes. Well, like I say, I prefer this version of Dracula anyway. And then basically the remake takes everything that this one does well and dials it up. I would highly recommend it to you, Joe. I think you'd really like it. And like the performance, Kinski's performance in that is spellbinding. It's like watching Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs. Like it's that level.
Yeah. Well, Klaus Kinski was an intense,
very
crazy.
Is it a spoken?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and full color as well. So that the reason I
1979.
79. The reason I mention it because I don't recall if it was in the original, but definitely in the remake. Like regarding his sexuality and her sexuality, like I think it's the remake because Orlok talks. One of the things he says is how lonely he is. He's so lonely. It's like one of his like most famous scenes is when he's talking. I think he's talking to the main character. He's just saying how lonely he is, and it again, you know, kind of plays in because I think that's implied in the original. If it's not outright said, it's definitely implied, right? That he's.
There are moments where you think, "Oh, he's a good chap." Like where he
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
There are, because there's the one point where Hutter in the castle.
That is not altruistic.
Wait for it. he cuts himself.
To get all up in his business for his
blood.
Then
but he can't help but have the animalistic instincts he has. So when he sees the blood, he then tries to suck the blood off Hutter's hands. But then when he goes after him to the thrones by the fireplace, he goes, "Sit down, my friend." And he has these moments of
but he has him sit
humility.
down so he can suck his blood because he has the bites.
Yeah, but let's talk some more. Yes, I know there is that to it as well. But then there is also later on, you can see this as him stalking and staring at Ellen from
standing at his window.
Yeah, that could also signify loneliness. It depends how we look at the character. If we look at the character as something that is completely animalistic and only has a hunger for one thing, then yeah, it's quite dark and terrible that he's stalking her. If you look at it as a fact that actually he's quite lonely, standing there.
I don't know. I think this character's so far removed from humanity that I'm not sure that I can see the loneliness angle. That's definitely an angle in most Dracula adaptations. And you could possibly make that point that it's minimised, but it's there. But I think it's minimised because of the animalistic tendencies.
Well, I think that him being lonely is better represented in this version because he's defeated by a woman, like, who uses her sexuality to distract him. Like, he loses his composure, right?
Yeah, but loneliness is out of a desire for company. He's not out of a desire for company. He's out of a desire for a blood. If it's any emotion, it's lust.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's like...
I don't think it's the same thing.
Yeah,
it's interesting because, like, he can't help but want that. He's animalistic in that way. He can't help but go after her blood. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, because he's a creature of base desires.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think complex... In my like the way it's interpretational because it's a silent movie, right? And you're taking things from their performance that aren't necessarily spoken. But my interpretation is that he's animalistic and he doesn't have or care to have these complex thoughts of loneliness or anything else. He's base desires. He wants this and he's going for it.
You say that, but earlier in the film, he's annoyed that Hutter comes so late because all the servants have gone to bed. So he does seem to care about servants.
But there are no servants, are there? Isn't
he wakes up in the morning and there's a full breakfast.
I like to imagine Orlok doing it.
Orlok's doing
no,
that
he's
shit.
not.
We don't see a single servant.
There's at least one coach driver.
And the coach driver, because that's not Orlok.
Yeah, that's definitely not Orlok.
The coach driver that drives real fast up to the...
Yeah, that's not Orlok.
That is Orlok.
No, it's not. It's not his official... start his official first opening is when you see him in the archway.
Yeah, and because remember, like, he puts himself in a coffin and then there's a coach driver that drives him away. Like, he's not doing both things. He's not in the coffin and driving his own coach when he's leaving.
I thought it was spooky vampire magic.
Well, there is some spooky
vampire magic. Yeah, when the coffin goes on.
He can't duplicate himself. Yeah. Incidentally,
I didn't find that crystal clear. I'm sure that's not...
It's not crystal clear, because I thought the same thing, but in my reading...
That guy
in preparation
is not played by Max Schreck.
I can tell you.
I wouldn't be able to tell you that.
Because if it's played by him, I'm saying it's him. So.
Yeah, but then how does he get from the coach to...
Vampire magic. Don't care, but that's
a wizard did it.
Yeah, a wizard did it. Yeah. See, they didn't have these story problems in the book.
Whoa. So, what do you think about the kind of perceived theme of anti-Semitism in it?
It's not really there.
You don't think so?
No.
What makes you feel so strongly that it's not there?
Because it's just because you can turn that on its head as well. Like, you can look into that and see that if you really want to see that. There's a lot of interpretations. To me, that holds no real water. It doesn't hold water. No.
I was only minorly aware of this, and I don't think it's a thing. Particularly.
Well, I also don't as well, but you can't deny that within the context of the film's production, that this sentiment was rife.
But we also have
this scapegoating was a thing. They were going through a massive economic crunch.
But any movie made around that time, regardless of where it was made, the place that it was made in was rife with anti-Semitism.
Yeah, when the issue we also
can't just apply everything to everything.
Yeah, but there are very few movies of that time that have a character like Count Orlok that looks that way. It's
the other issue.
You can't ignore it.
When did Der Stürmer start, which was the big caricature magazine in Germany that invented a lot of these caricaturish stereotypes? That must have been after 22. I'm thinking.
I honestly have no idea, but I believe that these
I think it's too early for that, in my opinion.
I don't think so.
I think the other issue we have looking back on this is that we have the context of what happened to Germany soon after this. We have a lot of context. At this time, in 1922, they could not imagine another war breaking out. This is to them. This is not an interwar period.
Yeah, but it's not it's not a declaration of war. It's like just the sentiment of the people. But anti-Semitism was rife. Like,
but Der Stürmer started in 1923. I just looked it up.
Yeah,
so that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't.
Yeah, but like there must have been a
representation of Jewish people.
There must have been a market for it. Though.
Yes, but I'm just saying that makes it less likely because that wouldn't have been. I don't know any Germans. I don't know any Germans from 1922, but it wasn't popularized.
But another theory
into the mainstream. I don't know.
Another theory is the flip of the coin of this, where Orlok is the outsider, and is the person being put in a position where they are seen as an other person.
Yeah,
that's definitely.
I mean, like the theme of other is why it's so resonant now.
Yeah,
but because we don't obviously pick up on explicit anti-Semitic themes now, but like the anti-Semitic theme is like a subset of the other.
But I don't think it is. I don't think there is anti-Semitism within it.
It's a fear of the foreign, where to a point you could possibly say xenophobia.
Yeah.
But I don't think specifically anti-Semitism.
Well, if we can agree on a theme of othering and a theme of xenophobia potentially,
I can agree on that. Yeah.
Then like,
I just don't think it's particular race being.
So I meant to say, sorry, that the flip of the coin is you could see Orlok as the forthcoming Nazi Party member. You could see him as Hitler. You could look at the film like that as well. So it's easy to flip that coin and say that this character was a what's his name? I keep thinking the little rat thing.
What, Nock?
Nock, sorry, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting.
Nock is a follower of Hitler, right? Yeah, and Hitler is Orlok.
Yeah, I mean, because there
are implement it, interpret it any number of ways because it's an ambiguous foreign threat. That's all we really know, and you can extrapolate that. Put any meanings you want on top of that, but that is what it is.
Yes, there are two. What you're saying is correct, that there is ambiguity, which is why people are still discussing it to this day. But there are two things that I like to say. Firstly, he's explicitly not German. That doesn't. I have heard people say that he does represent the rising Nazi Party, but he's explicitly not German, and they have made changes to the source material to make him more palatable to a German audience, changing the saying, changing the names. But they specifically chose to keep him as not a German national.
Neither was Hitler. Yeah, he was Austrian.
Yeah, that's points in the xenophobe department, and also, I mean, you could easily.
And Hitler made Germany his adopted home, just like Orlok makes his adopted home Germany.
Yeah, which is why it works. But
it works anyway because this is years before the rise of Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party. At this point, they were looking at either communism or social democracy in Germany.
I think the Nazi Party was founded shortly after this, though. So there may have been...
There must have been, sentiment.
But it was very fringe until Hitler.
Sentiment. Well, when did Hitler get into power?
It was founded in 1920.
So it was around, but it didn't... It meant something very different before Hitler was involved in it.
Hitler would have been very famous in 1923 because of the beer hall putsch, which is after this movie.
So it's around. This was happening around that time.
Yeah, which is why you can have the discussion, right?
You can flip that coin. On the one hand, you can say anti-Semitism. On the other hand, you could say is Hitler.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is another wrinkle to the story as well, which is firstly that Murnau himself was part of a persecuted minority, right, as a gay man. And so
is that full on?
It's about as confirmed fact as
is it confirmed? Because I had no one actually say it was confirmed in my research.
I've always heard of him described as a gay man. How about you, Mike?
I didn't know either way.
Oh, right.
Because I'm
not so bothered about people's personal life personally.
Well, no, because it's relevant.
It's relevant.
I guess that it is relevant, but me personally, I don't.
And also the actor. There may be others, but definitely the actor that plays Nock is Jewish, as well, which is interesting, right? And so you do kind of would believe that he would be somewhat sympathetic towards the plight, and which is why I'm also leaning towards it not being anti-Semitic. But you can't deny, that.
Yeah, but people of marginalised or minority groups favour populist and right-wing leaders all the time because they don't like the particular group that leader wants to litigate against or legislate against. People often vote against their own interests if they're taken in by propaganda and they blame the wrong people for their own misfortunes. So it happens all the time.
So you're saying it's possible that Murnau could have been brought in by like anti-Semitic
that's entirely possible.
Yeah, no,
I'm not saying. I'm not saying that it did, but I'm saying.
And also, you can just imbibe that stuff too, right? You can just through osmosis pick up like things that.
Yeah, if all the people around you feel a certain way, it's very difficult to not feel that way.
Well, Murnau was famously very left wing. He was on the extreme left wing of Germany at that time. He was member of a party. I can't remember the name of the party, but he later on denied it. But probably more due to the fact that they're under Nazi rule.
Yeah,
and he had to,
but
he used to play piano and stuff for a group in 1920s. And I can't think of what they're called. But anyway, I've not seen it confirmed he was gay or not, to be honest. But I keep reading things.
Take like photographs of like a gay actor.
I don't know about that.
I have to get the name.
What I do know is that has led to an interpretation of the film and a whole book written on the film where Nosferatu, Count Orlok, is a gay man who is being othered because of that, and he's actually not a terrible... I disagree with the interpretation of that, and I think it's leaning too heavily on you're trying to look for something that perhaps isn't there for that.
I think it's
in that interpretation.
Ambiguity taken to extremes when people do that kind of thing. Have you ever seen Room? This is slightly off topic, but I think it's relevant.
Don't talk
Room
about
237, right? Yeah. Which is it's about The Shining. It was masquerading as a documentary about The Shining, where they get a bunch of people in to talk about their theories about what The Shining means to them. And there's someone who's talking about it means 9/11, it means this, it means that, and they're taking all of these specific things, and it makes sense to them, but to us, it's more of a documentary about how people can take a piece of ambiguous art and make it into anything they want. And I think that's what's happening here. People look too hard into these kind of things. There might be some ambiguity there for the purposes of audience thought.
And
but I think to look deeper without knowing the man, Murnau, personally, is a fool's errand, in my opinion.
I think
that's just like dismissive of like art criticism, like and analysis.
No, people can think that, but they can't say it's a confirmed thing, is what I'm saying.
No, of course not. But like, we're not saying definitively anything. We're just talking about it.
He's imprinted.
No, I'm not attacking you. I'm attacking the people that are saying that is what it's about.
He's obviously imprinted on this. This is his idea to bring this Count Orlok to life as this Dracula character in the way he has. So, if he is a gay man, then there might be something imprinted within it on that, just because he is creating this. He will imprint who he is.
You're saying
potentially, he's imprinting what he is in life and his experiences within this film. So that includes his journey through World War One. There's a bit in the film where they say the plague is spreading, which is interestingly, you get different contexts depending on the version you watch. So if you watch the Masters of Film version, you get this in German. So they use the original German cards on the film, and then they do subtitles. But within that, they don't put in the word "young people were dying." So, like, what's the actual word? I've written it down. They put in here somewhere. Yeah, young people are being swept away in large numbers. So the Eureka version lost that in its translation. So you miss out on this whole context of young people dying. To me, quite obviously, harking back to the First World War.
It's quite interesting with a silent movie, being as though you do get such few verbal confirmation of what's happening. Changing small amounts of dialogue even like that has a massive impact.
Even innocently through translation. It is interesting.
Because none of us speak German or read German. So for all we know, we don't have the truest picture we can have as to what
there's also like
and therefore what the movie is about.
Yeah, but there's also no like guarantee, right, that those intertitles are authentic either, even if they're written in German.
Yeah,
right?
correct.
Like,
Because they were found in some backlot or something, and I think there's a little bit of
there's like the history of the actual restorations is fascinating. Like the way that they like fill in from different reels and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
like,
because it could have easily been destroyed forever.
Yeah,
and a lot of movies from that time period are lost forever.
Yeah, you do somewhat lose the context of the original. It's very hard to go back but I think what I'd like about this, if this was the intention to make it ambiguous in this way by Murdoch, then I think he's done a very good job.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it lends itself. This is what I love about piece of art. When I've tried to make stuff in the past, I try to make it as ambiguous as possible. I want someone to read into it what they want to read into it. I don't like being led all the time. I do in some instances.
Yeah, that's the nature of art. Right?
Yeah,
it should be different for everybody else.
But this is more like a painting. Yeah. This is more like something of old. This has got less to do with modern filmmaking in a way. It has more to do with pictures and paintings and interpretation of this expressionism culture that was happening in the early 20th century and the 19th century. And a lot of it comes from that art scene in Berlin. So you see a lot of that. I mean, when looking at a documentary that's on a version of the Blu-ray, they talk about how a lot of these scenes, because I noticed a lot of them are static, right? Watching it, there's not many moving camera shots. It's all very static. It's all very picture-like. And that's because in a way...
It was quite difficult to do a lot of moving shots at the time.
It would have been, but at the same time, then what do you go to? And you look at a picture of something, and there's certain scenes which show you that. So you've got Ellen; she's always pictured or always set near a window or near light. She represents this light side, this innocence. Whereas someone like Count Orlok is trapped inside.
Yeah,
is looking out at something more.
There's definitely a lot of kind of archways framing Orlok.
Yeah,
and framing it. What's his name at the castle as well?
Hutter.
Yeah, to signify like the claustrophobia and the oppressiveness of the area and that kind of thing.
When Orlok
quite inventive
comes into his bedroom, the archway. It's a bit like a coffin. Right? The way he walks through, and it's these sort of almost artistic shots. They're not necessarily what we would use in film today, unless you were making a very avant-garde type film. But then, for me, it represents like the pictures through pictures, and this is how filmmakers at the time wouldn't have had other films to go off. They've only got their influences from the arts for galleries. Going to, he used to go to galleries and he used to go, we've got to go here. They took a holiday in the middle of the filming of Nosferatu, and they said, we have to go to this gallery. And they did, and this is what influenced them.
Yeah.
It wasn't by the pictures. It was
are beautiful.
Yeah,
as in you could print screen them on.
It's lovely. Yeah, the film just looks incredible. That's what I love about it. That's
one of the movie's greatest strengths, in my opinion. Some of those shots are just iconic for a reason. They're beautiful. Yeah.
So it's really incredible in that way, and I like the plot as is. I know you'll say.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to hark over the same point again. I don't necessarily agree.
I was saying, let's go into the plot a bit there then. So, because I'm interested in the differences of this compared to Dracula in a way, and we've gone into it a bit, but are the main points still there? The ideas of Hutter going to to Romania.
The opening is
the most faithfully recreated.
Pretty much the same, apart from the names. Pretty much the same.
Incidentally, the names were changed not to avoid copyright, but just to make it more appealing to an audience.
Oh, really? So it wasn't actually to do with that copyright?
No, because they say based on Dracula in one of the credits.
Yeah.
So they wasn't.
Who are we to know that that's an original?
Well, yeah, but I don't think it was like a big secret that it was an unofficial adaptation. But that's supposedly the reason is that they changed the names is not to like try and hide the fact that they're aping Dracula, just to make it more palatable to a German audience at that time.
But they did specifically like lament people using it with the real names, though, didn't they? Because of the legal troubles and possible legal troubles.
What do you mean? Who's they?
Like Murnau and others the production didn't want people releasing it with the real names.
Well, I don't know about that. I always thought that they just. I just heard that they did it just to make it more palatable to a German audience. Because I believe that there was like some demand at the time in Germany for like new German productions, right? Like for the German people. Wasn't there like an embargo on outside art at that time?
Yeah, there was. So at that time point, not only could you not really bring in Hollywood films at that point, and it cost a lot of money. You from 1916, there was something about that as well. So it was difficult. Hollywood movies from 1916 to 2020.
Still no Hollywood in Germany. Glad they put a stop to it.
Yeah, from 1916 to December 2020, foreign film imports were banned. So there was a big German market at the time, and also a lot of the films were easier to make, cheaper to make, and cheaper to export to other countries. So Eastern Europe and South America took a lot of German films at the time rather than Hollywood films because it would cost a lot more money to send across than Hollywood film. So there was a lot of profiteering to be made on this stuff, and with hyperinflation happening, it has actually made it easier for these filmmakers to do this, and it actually helped the art scene rather than hindered it, especially on the filming side of it.
Very interesting.
But yeah, the whole like the first acts of the book, more or less, is relatively well translated. Right, I would say. Yeah.
Same with the bit on the ship.
The bit on the ship,
Pretty much the same.
Yeah. My two favourite parts of the book were the most well preserved. Yeah.
It's like you direct this book.
Yeah. Honestly, like it really appeals to me, and I absolutely love the remake.
It took all of the romanticism of the villain, or have Orlok/Dracula out of it, I would argue. Made him more animalistic, took away all of the Christian iconography. He's not. He doesn't have a human backstory anymore. He's explicitly said to be like a demon, right? He doesn't create other vampires in the story. Unlike
I noticed that.
He doesn't have any brides.
The,
he doesn't. There's no like Lucy character that becomes a Dracula.
They got married.
Lou Dracula,
Mrs. Dracula. Yeah. There's no Lucy. He gets killed by sunlight. Well. So the ending is the biggest change. But like the whole vampires like burning in the sun and dying because of the sunlight was invented by this film, because in Dracula it just weakens him. He just like has to like cover up, but he's fine.
Yeah. He basically only hunts at night, but he can go for a stroll if he wants.
Yeah, he can walk. He can walk in the daylight. He's just weakened.
Yeah.
There's a big focus on plague and pestilence, and there's a lot of the association between.
He can't transform into a bat or a wolf or anything else that he transforms into.
Well, he is death, isn't he? Like he is death. Like he brings death with him.
It's as if he's famine from the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Yeah.
Isn't pestilence?
Or pestilence. Yeah. Well, either or.
Whatever. He's all of them.
Any of them are relevant.
Especially war. Yeah.
What's the fourth one?
War.
No, well, we've got war, pestilence, and famine. What's the...
Death.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, he's all four. Confirmed.
Another big difference is, we mentioned it before, like the reduction of Van Helsing's part.
Yeah.
Like completely depowered. He's basically an irrelevant character, in my opinion. Whereas he's a massive... He's basically the protagonist of the second half of the book, really, right? Because...
Well, yeah, he's the mainest character, because he's the leader of the group that
like Jonathan Harker is kind of your kind of vehicle into the world, right? Because you go on the journey with him in the first act into the castle, but then he gets taken out of the story for a little while.
Yeah, before he reappears.
And then he reappears at the end, but then he joins up with Van Helsing, who's kind of leading. He's like a science expert. Like
he's very much in the background of...
Yeah, he's nothing really. But in Dracula,
he just cries a bit at the end.
In Dracula, he's like an expert on like religion, science, and like demonology.
He's basically a man who's prepped his entire life for like facing vampires.
What else have I got here? Orlok looks inhuman, whereas Dracula mostly looks human. And finally, the ending. So in Nosferatu, Ellen more or less single-handedly destroys.
She sacrifices
Yeah, she
herself for the
sacrifices
good of
herself.
humanity, doesn't she?
Whereas in the book, if I remember correctly, because he travels to London, but they chase him away. Like
he
Van Helsing's party chases him away, and he runs back to the castle. And then there's like the final act, right, where half of them go for Dracula and half of them go for someone else, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's a lot more Salem's Lot. It's a lot more team effort against the vampire kind of thing.
Yeah. They go back to his castle and get him in his castle at the end.
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe it's one of his brides that's still alive. I feel
I get very confused because of the amount of Dracula adaptations I've seen. Yeah.
So what do you make of the expressionism, the way it's filmed? Do you think it stacks up?
I think that's the strongest part of the movie. I think that's what makes the movie special. I've already said it's got weaker elements in the other side, but if we're talking about the visuals and the expressionist portrayal of
the visuals are so striking.
Yeah, that's what makes the movie a great movie. Yeah.
And it's so, I don't know, I just always go back to that when he's in the hallway and then when he comes up, it's like inhuman for him to rise like that.
Well, like the physicality of that performance, like he's always kind of unnatural. He's always slightly at an angle, or there's something always inhuman and unnatural.
Supposedly like the first method acting.
Yeah, you hear all kinds of weird.
I love these rumours though.
Max Schreck was supposed to be like wild carding and weirding it out. As,
well, there's like a big theory, like
he's an actual vampire.
That is an actual theory.
We need to cover that film, like Shadow of the Vampire, at some point. But
it's a good one.
But there's a big theory that Shrek. Well, firstly, there's a big theory that it doesn't exist. But there's
even though he's in other movies.
Yeah, well, there's a more credible theory that he like suffered.
And Shrek translates, doesn't it, to something in German?
Probably.
I can't remember what it actually translates to. Look at that up. What does Shrek translate to in German? Because that adds to the lore of him as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Shrek is like death or something in German.
Oh, well, that seems pretty perfect. Is it a stage name then, or is it his actual name? Do you know?
No, I don't know that.
Yeah. But there's a big theory that, like, because he fought in World War One, that he has PTSD.
Right.
And he was very reclusive on set, very very strange on set. So yeah, incidentally,
Fright.
Yeah, Fright. Yeah, Fright.
Yeah,
something like that.
Perfect name.
That's
perfect
some Lucifer Valentine.
Yeah.
Have you heard like the kind of legend of how this story, the film came about? By the way, you probably have, Joe. I'm not
sure. Don't think so.
So like the producer of the movie is this guy called Albin Grau.
He's like
Grau. He's like an occultist.
He's in the
artist.
occult.
Yeah, he's like an occultist artist. And supposedly he was, fighting World War One, and there was like a story. I think it was in Serbia or something. He like met a farmer, right? Who apparently claimed that his father or his grandfather or something was a vampire.
Yeah,
right.
And it's just like they were just like sharing a beer at the end of the day or something.
Yeah, it was like
just like
around the fire,
campfire talk.
Yeah,
and then like this story
that folklore from
they buried this guy without doing the proper funeral rites, and they were worried that he was going to come back to life.
Yeah, they didn't give him like his last rites or something like that.
So they dug him back up and staked the guy.
Yeah,
and this inspired Alvin Grau. Presumably, Dracula had been out for some time at this point, so he probably just like made that click, right?
Yeah.
Like,
and he was a huge influence on the film. Like he brought in a lot of that.
He brought in like the money and the art as well.
He did.
Right? Like,
and he followed the production crew around as well. So he was part of why in the background there's things like mathematical magic and things like that. That's what is in the papers.
There's like a Nokian
the
language,
has.
right?
Yeah. I didn't know.
It's kind of a cool story, yeah.
And this when he's doing the Venus flytrap bit.
Yep.
In the background, there's some more of that in the background. So this Van Helsing character may not be forefront, but there is still this idea that he knows of the science and is still obsessed with this stuff, even though it's not in the same way. He's not like the hero of the story. And in the background there is sort of stuff hung on his wall, which is all very influenced by what's his face, by Grau. Sorry, I'm not good with names. I know what they look like, but I don't know names. Let's talk a bit more about the history of it. I think that's sometimes where the most fascinating part of this whole thing is, and it's almost lost and then reappearance years later to become this classic film that it is now. So he was sued by the widow of Dracula author
Bram Stoker.
Bram Stoker, yeah. So
Well, Miss Stoker.
Miss, yeah,
Don't know her name.
Miss Stoker. She actually, she wasn't even aware of this film until basically its premiere, and then found out about it, and then just tried very, very hard to have it extinguished forever, and every single copy just completely deleted from history, and it almost
Which
worked.
could have easily worked at that time because there's so many lost movies.
Yeah, and his
Just through
first
negligence, let alone willful destruction.
Yeah, his first 9 movies were all lost. This carried on and on for years. And I'll get my obligatory reference in now. Happened with Doctor Who.
There it is. I've been waiting the whole episode.
Well, I'll get my favourite anecdote about lost movies in.
Go on.
There's a movie called The Unknown, and it was lost for 50 years because it was labelled unknown. And it was in a stack of other ones called unknown because nobody knew what they were. But it was called unknown because it was called The Unknown. Yeah, so it was lost for 50 years.
Wow, that is cool.
Yeah,
Well,
great movie as well.
yeah.
10 out of 10.
Well, and a lot of that. So it was a lot of the Patrick Troughton era that's lost. About a third of all his episodes are lost. It's a real travesty.
Well, yeah, they just used to re-record over, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
They had no concern for...
But I think the biggest travesty of all is that there was a whole series of episodes lost in the 1990s because they went meh. Like that.
What do you mean they went meh?
They just went meh and they deleted them. They got rid of them.
Somebody must have VHS copies of those.
Well, no, because they weren't ever repeated again. That's the thing. But a lot of the copies you find now of these old Doctor Who episodes are actually like Australian versions. A lot of the BBC versions don't exist anymore. There's a famous one in the Hartnell era where, because Australia are very into their what's the word? PC
censorship.
Yeah. The Australia are very into their censorship. There's a whole scene where someone gets beaten up to death. And you don't catch any of that. They actually cut that out. So the actual original BBC version is lost, and we only have the censored Australian
Doctor
version.
Who had people beating to death.
Yeah. Apparently,
Is it William Hartnell?
This is what you should have been. This is what you should have been saying to sell it to me. Death beating.
It's like yeah, but it's lost forever, and there's only one little clip of it left because it was in like a Blue Peter episode or something.
Right.
I don't know. I don't think it was Blue Peter, but it was something.
Blue Peter
episode ever.
Anyway. The first 9 films of what's his name?
Murno.
Yeah. You have that a lot with silent film directors. Like a huge swathe of their filmography is just lost to time. Some of the biggest, there's like a Lon Chaney Dracula adaptation before this one.
Really?
Slightly, I think by a year, which is a lost film, and that was by Todd Browning. I might be wrong about the date, but it's definitely Todd Browning. It's definitely Lon Chaney, and that's a lost film.
But this really marks then Dracula being on film for the first time, or surviving. So it's the first surviving version of a vampire on film.
I think so. Of any kind of accessibility or fame or note.
Yeah. But so with this idea, they nearly lost this film in 1925 due to this, and a lot of the copies were burnt. And it was one singular copy, I think in the US of all places, where it was. And there's one instance where she found out there was a private screening at this film
festival.
No, actors and producers they were part of a group, and they had a private screening, and she wasn't happy that it was still in existence. And they were like, "Well, you can't stop us because your copyright claim is to do with it being shown in public, but we're a group. We're not showing it anywhere else. This is private. This has got nothing to do with you." And then it kind of was never lost. It's never properly a lost film. It's just very much existed.
Like the underground.
But
it's like
came
George
back.
Lucas with the Star Wars holiday special.
Yeah.
Very similar survival. Yeah.
But then, as we said, it lost its context because it was all without the tinting. And all silent films in that era were really tinted, and to show the difference between day and night. There's the scene in Nosferatu where he's carrying the coffin next to the church.
That's the most obvious point at which it's daytime.
They shot in day.
They shot that about midday or something like this. It was about midday.
Well, night filmography was very difficult in the 20s.
Was it even
Yeah.
possible? Is it even possible to film at night? Back
Probably
then?
very difficult.
I don't think so.
It's much easier to just put a blue tint over it.
You could probably do pseudo night in a studio, but I don't know whether you could do actual night in.
I mean, don't you need like actual light in order to like capture film on those cameras?
Or maybe a little later. There's a movie called Man with a Movie Camera. It's a Russian movie, and it's like a pioneer for like thousands of different editing and like camera techniques. I reckon if there's a first movie that filmed at night, it's probably that one. So, yeah.
But yeah, you can see in the scenes which they filmed of him going through the courtyard and by the church, they filmed as Orlok's having the makeup done. They filmed Hutter leaving on his horse to go and get Orlok from the castle. So they did that a few hours later, and you can tell because the shadows have changed very slightly. So you can tell basically it's very close together, but 2 hours apart from the Orlok scene to the next scene. Yeah. And all the castle scenes were basically done in Berlin inside. The exteriors and the actual castle is all there, real. Like they used it, the top of the hill. It was an amazing castle on top of a hill. And then they used, and a lot of it still exists today. Unfortunately, a lot of the architecture and where you've got the running the villagers through the streets, a lot of that is gone because of the Second World War and the bombing by the Allies, and also they've lost that opening shot, the spire in the opening shot of the town. That spire is gone. The church is there because they filmed it through a roof, like a lopper ladder, a very
Sounds totally safe.
yeah, exactly, yeah, very like rickety ladder, and they filmed it through that to get this shot. And now, unfortunately, that spire is gone, so a lot of this is not there anymore. However, the abandoned warehouse, which Orlok calls home, is still there, and it's almost hasn't changed. Even where they filmed hasn't changed in that area. There's just a tree there now, and which is basically where he's looking out the window.
One for when we do podcast on tour.
Yeah. Where we go
Along
to
with
Germany.
The graveyard from Night of the Living Dead, etc. Yeah.
So it's really cool, and and to me it has this thing about the history of it's not only the history of the film and the film itself, it's like the lost history of the architecture of that era, and you have all these lovely winding little paths and streets and backyards which they used, which are gone now because they've all been updated. People have updated them. They're lost to time, and they're on this film.
Yeah.
And it's something, I know it's a horror film, but there's almost something romantic with that, and this romanticism era of film.
Yeah, and as architecture changes and moves on, that will always be true of any movies.
So that's what I always like about these films as well. And yeah, so you almost lost this film to time. It would have been a travesty to lose this film, I think.
It's a travesty.
Like
to
the
lose
entire
any
genre
film.
would be different, right? Like
It's
impossible to even to imagine that
incredibly
reality.
important.
Yeah.
And I think no matter what you think of the film, you got its importance to what came after it.
Yeah, that's one thing that can't be argued. I might be able to argue some things about this movie, but its importance is inarguable.
Now, let's chat briefly about the differences of the films. We've mentioned it, we've touched upon it with the two Blu-rays we got here are really the two available in the UK which are of any note. There are some random versions on YouTube. It's kind of out there free of charge. People can play around with it as they like, but there's versions with missing scenes, not a lot of context. And you brought this up, Dave. So what did you find when you started researching these difference? How did you find out?
Well, I mean, it all happened a little bit by accident, to be honest. I was just looking to go into a local shop to go and buy a copy for us firstly for me to watch, and second for us to kind of put on display here. No, go to the store and then spot two versions right next to each other, and I'm already stumped. So and I considered
that cool that they'd stock both.
Yeah, it was very fortunate, because if this particular store didn't happen to have both versions right next to each other, I would have just come in and grabbed the one
in the dark.
Just come in and grab the one that I was.
If it was one particular version, you might have been more negative.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And I noticed they were at different price points, and so I just thought, I'm in the store. I got a little second. I'm on my lunch break. I do a quick kind of search. Which one should I get?
And then you open Pandora's box.
And I opened, exactly. I opened Pandora's box, and I stumbled onto one blog that kind of went into some pretty serious detail, kind of about the history of the different restorations, and I think like the 5 or 6 kind of major Blu-ray releases that are available worldwide. Of those, these 2 that we have in front of us are the primary ones in the UK. So yeah, as we said before, we have the Eureka Masters of Cinema here on, I guess that's camera left, and then BFI camera right. And so I was reading through this blog, and firstly, it's massive. I wonder if we can link it, maybe.
What's that? Plop it in the description.
Yeah, like put the blog in the description.
Oh yeah.
And so as I was reading through this blog and focusing particularly on the 2 copies I had in front of me, the thing that struck me the most about this particular author's description of them is that it wasn't such a clear-cut decision that one was better, at least according to this description. So for example, the BFI one here, he claimed, came from an older restoration from 1995. Okay, and it had a more up-to-date, relatively more up-to-date soundtrack, which was recorded in the 50s. I'll check the composer's name, but he's a Hammer composer.
James Bernard.
James Bernard, yeah. So he re-recorded the soundtrack in the 50s, and as far as I can tell, he was not basing it or inspired by the original soundtrack whatsoever.
No, it's a lot more of the 50s, of the early Hammer.
Yes, and you can definitely hear the kind of influence of the Hammer score, like in the score itself.
Yeah, like gothic kind of, hot. What you would very, stereotypically say is a horror soundtrack.
Yes, it definitely feels like a horror soundtrack.
Yeah.
Like one thing that somebody pointed out to me somewhere online was that, like with Dracula, where the Dracula theme in those Hammer movies is 3 beats, right? Dracula, right? And then the Nosferatu theme is 4 beats. Nosferatu, right? And that recurs all the way through.
It's a recurring theme throughout. Whenever there's
when it's like his motif, right? So this is from a 1995 restoration, the BFI version, and this author kind of described it as kind of more rough around the edges. There's a lot more noticeable film grain. It's a lot kind of darker and feels kind of like the score, more kind of horror-y of the 2. And the way he went on to describe the other one, the Master of Cinema one, is that it comes from a much newer and cleaner restoration of the movie from 2006. But he didn't. He basically said, that just because it's newer, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. No. And he went on to kind of describe this, this version as having a soundtrack that was more authentic to the original 20s score, but that they'd, in some ways, the restoration was imperfect despite being newer because a lot of the picture was kind of overexposed, kind of too bright in a lot of scenes. And so, and for me at that time, that was enough for me to kind of decide to go buy the BFI one, and I took that home and watched it and loved it, really loved it.
Yep.
I find like the score and the darker shots and the more prevalent kind of film grain and film damage to be very useful in setting the tone of the story.
It's part of like the like touch and feel of the movie. But despite that, I couldn't get it out of my head, this other version, that it wasn't so clear cut, that actually just because it was a new restoration and it wasn't necessarily better, but was actually distinct enough that he could write so much about it. And I just couldn't get it out of my head. And so a couple of days later, I went back and bought the other version and then watched it. And I was really blown away by how different it was compared to the one that I'd already seen. To the point that I was, I'd had like one open on my laptop and one open on my TV, and I was comparing them, shot for shot. And I do agree overall. I think both of you now have seen both versions, right? Yep.
I do agree overall with the original author, which is that the BFI version is definitely my preferred version of the 2. It's an older restoration, but it's definitely more to my taste. Like the damage, it feels more horror-y, and that works for me.
I think for the strength of the soundtrack alone,
it's
my preferred version. If you could copy paste that soundtrack onto that, maybe for me, there'd be a discussion as to which was the better, but BFI just wins all the way because of the soundtrack.
Yeah, well, the soundtrack is better. I prefer the picture as well. I like it actually more damaged. I like it darker. I think that there are places where the tinting is different as well.
Yeah.
I'm relatively indifferent to that overall. And I do prefer the intertitles on the Masters of Cinema version, which the intertitles are written in German and translated with subtitles in English. So I do prefer that. So if anything, I would just take those intertitles.
Yeah,
from
I think that's one of the only winning points of that. But at the same time, it depends which intertitles you're talking about, because some of them are just plain white English text on a black background, which obviously have no real merit to them. I can't say they're anything good. But the ones that are when they're reading from a book and they're stylized English text on a page, I think those have merit. I think those are up there with the German ones. Those
I mean, because they actually did put considerable effort, I think, into doing the intertitles in the BFI version. They're written in English, but there's definitely a lot of art to them.
Yeah, some of them are very stylized.
It's part of it. The idea of expressionism isn't only within the film; it's within the font and it's within the style. So it was important when BFI did the restoration in the 90s, in 1997, that the tints and tones of the original film were restored, that you had the context finally being put back into the film, and that isn't only in that, it's within those the titles as well. It's the whole film comes together, and it's also, though, interestingly, an interpretation. I would say the Masters of Cinema version is trying more to replicate what was originally intended, and the original Hans Erdmann score, the first actually put down on like a record, was used in that version. So it's much more of a, if you want to look at it from perspective, BFI is more like an interpretation, and the Master of Cinema one is like a historical context. So I think they're important in different ways. I think the Master of Cinema is really important as a historical piece to try and bring it back to how it originally was, whereas the BFI version kind of makes it timeless. It just, the bits that are there boost them.
Yeah, it's
the importance you put on authenticity is what it boils down to.
But I don't think the BFI version is inauthentic.
No, I don't.
No.
I think that's the interesting thing about this, is because it would be quite easy for them to have crossed that line, and I don't think they have.
It doesn't mean inauthentic, it just means less authentic. If you're not using the original score or the original intertitles in one version, it by definition has to be less authentic.
In a way, but then you...
Yeah, but I mean, both versions are cobbled together from like several... Like, the restoration is like not a simple...
The missing parts were from safety prints. A lot of them, what they were missing is safety prints, and from a specific French one that was found. So it was a French copy of the film. And they basically, any restoration of this film now comes from a print they found back like in 50s or 60s or something. So a lot of this stuff is basically all from this one interpretation. Everything they put on film, you could argue, is a different film. It's a different artistry. There's a performance within it itself. Like, it's not just the original intended performance. There's something else there because someone else has touched it, played with it, cut it. It all adds and changes from the original. It's
impossible to actually see the authentic original.
Unless you time travel.
Yeah,
you can't.
Well, it is like, that, I think I've probably said it on this podcast before, that famous quote about a story being conceived 3 times, right, in cinema. Firstly, when it's written.
Could you pass me that?
Secondly, when it's shot, and finally when it's edited. And all 3 of them have significant artistry to them, right?
Yeah, and all 3 can make or break a movie.
Yes,
really.
Yes. And the restoration process itself is an art form, right? And it's why, like, both of them have, credits actually much longer than the credits of the movie are credited to the people involved in the restoration, because considerable work and considerable artistry goes into it.
Yeah, and it can massively changed the tone and quality of a movie. Because I don't think I'd ever seen the BFI version. I think when I watched it years and years ago, the first time I watched it, it was the Eureka version. And I had similar views to now, but I appreciate it a bit more now that I've seen the BFI version, because that is a better version. And it has a strong soundtrack, which is one of my complaints from when I watched it, 12 years ago. Yeah.
It's interesting, the interpretation of the film, no matter, because the music, because it's a silent movie as well, the interpretation changes everything, and who they chose originally in Hans Zimmer, that will change the interpretation. It's a little, like you say, a bit goofier. There's a scene where I watched the BFI version and went back to the Eureka version straight afterwards, so I could compare while it was fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
And it's just like, God, you lose a lot of you lose a lot from that.
The horror tone is sanitized a little bit. But that makes sense when horror wasn't a fully formed concept, and maybe
the concept of horror-y that we were using doesn't
exist in 1992.
It's not meaningful. Yeah.
And it's linked into the at the time, it makes it of its time, because the music is of a romanticism, an era of that sort of music. So it ties it in with the time period it's in, whereas the BFI version, to me, extends its lifespan. By quite a lot. It becomes
stops it being dated and makes it updated.
It's less of a historical artifact and more of a good film. Because of the BFI version. So it was a romantic style in Germany and Austria at the time. I just want to check what year James Bernard actually did that score. Could you check that?
I can. Composed this score for Nosferatu in 1997, so you were right. Or at least ChatGPT thinks you're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here I've got, it's from the BFI version, why I've asked Dave to pass this to me, is they've got a little thing in here by James Bernard himself when he scored this film in the 90s for this updated version. I think whatever we say, it's much more important what he says. I think we can interpret it, but his interpretation is, as he says here, the Dracula story always appealed to me, as did Nosferatu. I believe strongly in the powers of good and evil and the internal fight between God and the devil. Nosferatu had been quite a challenge. It was my first score for a silent film. There was no relaxing, no thunderstorms or clattering of horses' hooves. Manu subtitled the film as Symphony of Horrors, so I've tried to write a score that holds together like a symphony, or more aptly, a symphonic poem, a web of several contrasting themes. And then he kind of goes into the power of Orlok's evil must be felt strongly. His theme is unrelenting. Ellen has a sad romantic theme. And then Hutter is happy and innocent, so has an open-air rustic tune on woodwind. So you've got all this different stuff. And and among other things, he did a lot of the Hammer stuff. And he scored the Horror of Dracula in 1958.
It's an unsung art form. There was a guy on the Evolution of Horror podcast who his job was to take silent movies, relatively unknown ones, with no soundtrack, no conceivable idea of what the soundtrack was in the original times, and then soundtrack it himself, which sounds like a fascinating,
that sounds cool,
insanely good job. Like, that sounds amazing. I do have a tidbit as well. According to IMDb, a version was released in the 90s introduced by David Carradine with the music of goth metal band Typo Negative.
Cool.
So I don't know who they are, but that sounds great.
How do we get that Blu-ray?
Yeah, exactly.
I think there'd be something quite interesting about creating something musical above this film, because you can. It's free.
Anybody can.
It's on.
You can set the tone to be whatever you want.
So I'd quite like to see the Austin Powers theme stuff over it or something.
Well, people do that a lot, like the Wizard of Oz with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, and how it lines up eerily correctly. And I mean, anything can be interpreted in completely different ways if you change the entirety of the audio, which is what you're doing with a silent movie. Fascinating.
It is.
I mean, we might have to revisit it in 10 years if there's a new cut that's supposedly way better than the BFI cut. That might happen. Who knows?
But I just guess in the end, the Eureka version lacks the depth, and because of the score, lacks that depth that we expect from a movie today.
It doesn't bring you in.
No.
And it's too muted, the soundtrack. It doesn't add. If anything, it subtracts.
And it doesn't change when something happens on screen. It sometimes just stays in the same. I I like the beginning. The only bit I like is at the beginning. I find that a strong opening theme where she's playing with a cat.
Yeah, because it works with the happy times.
Yeah.
But the actual horror is massively like muted because of that soundtrack. Yeah.
Overall, then, Dave, how was your experience going back to 1922 and Nosferatu?
It was an absolute pleasure. I mean, I don't think I've watched this movie this intensely in my entire life. And I definitely came to find a new appreciation for it, I think, going through this process. And the process of kind of exploring these different versions and the history of this movie especially, in addition to, you know, all the usual things that we can talk about, like plot and theme. It was an absolutely fascinating experience. And to be honest, has kind of enriched my appreciation for cinema, especially cinema with this history behind it. And certainly, you know, going forward, I'll be kind of more interested in looking at different versions, especially of older things that have multiple restorations. Like I said, I mean, irrespective of all that, I mean, this is my preferred version of Dracula. I think it's a much more primal experience, and I think that everything works together to enhance that more stripped down version of the story. I mean, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it works. It works for me in the same way. I like the stripped down nature of it. It also it kind of double. I did a drama degree where we've studied this sort of time period, more so within the theatre scene, and then I did a history degree later on as a postgrad. So it's kind of piqued my interest through these different elements. I didn't expect it to. And when I first watched it, I was like, oh God, this is going to be a drag. When I first watched the film. But then I got more into it and I found something in there, and it's like a film I definitely will go back to now. It's a film that I will watch again, and I'm so glad that we've gone through this film and looked at this one, because I wouldn't have ever really done that.
Well, I hope it's inspired you to watch more silent movies.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Equally, I hope it's inspired other people that maybe have watched this movie and before they listen to this podcast or watch this podcast have watched it for the first time and never watched a silent movie, because silent movies are amazing, and I'm a big proponent of, well, most movies obviously, but right now we're talking about silent movies, and silent movies often get disregarded and put a little bit down because people think if they're lacking an entire component of what makes a movie, which is the audio, the talking, the dialogue, they're weaker or at a disadvantage. It's a much more difficult process to make them good, and I don't think that's necessarily the way. Creativity thrives under limitations, and with limitations of no sound, it's amazing what people in the silent era were able to come up with.
And it's quite amazing as well that this film, when you watch it, I mean, if you're out there and you're thinking, oh, do I actually watch this? Then just give it a chance and go with the BFI version if you're someone like that. Definitely. Just give it a chance, because some of the scenes in this, it's full of moments, this film, and they stack up against anything you put on screen today. There are certain moments that happen where you go, wow, that's incredible. Like I had like goosebumps. I was actually genuinely scared by the acting performance of Shrek. I say Shrek.
It's so weird to say Shrek.
Sorry.
Donkey. It's a good thing it wasn't in colour, because it'd be green, obviously.
Oh yeah. But it's an incredible performance by Max Shrek, but his portrayal of this Dracula character in Orlok, and everyone does an incredible job in it, really, for what it is. And it is of its time in a way, but it also transcends time. And that's what I think is worth going back to and watching, because you really find something within it. And I'm interested to see what happens with this new release later in the year and how that goes with the new adaptation with Willem Dafoe in it again.
Yeah. I don't know whether I'm going to hate it or love it. There's reasons for both.
Yeah.
I am primed to like it.
I know you are. I'm an absolute fanboy of Robert Eggers over there.
Not just that. I like Nosferatu.
Yeah.
So how do you leave this, Mike? Do you leave with any differing opinions to your start?
Well, I still have my qualms with this movie. But I don't think that prevents it in my mind from being an all-time classic and one of the most important movies in horror, because it just is. It's got some of the most iconic shots in horror history. What it did, I have to thank it every time I watch a vampire movie for what it added to the vampire mythology. Because, yeah, the addition of sunlight being a threat to kill them does add far more than you would think to the mythology of that creature. And without that, vampires would be so threatening that what would you do to defeat them, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, brilliant.
Fitting words to finish on, really. Yeah, it was a good one. I enjoyed. It's kind of different to what we would normally do. Going back to 1922, it's difficult. It was filmed in 1921, so it's a new change. It's something very different and something thoroughly enjoyed going through. So yeah, if you liked it, like, share, and subscribe. All the above, all of that stuff. If you watch it on YouTube. Hey, hello. Hi. And remember to follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and X/Twitter. And that is _stab in the dark. That's right, isn't it?
That is correct.
That is correct, yeah.
We know what we're doing.
We know the beach, we should know.
So _stab in the dark. We put on content on there as well, along with some nice little tidbits you can...
What tidbits? What are you talking about?
I look forward to these tidbits.
I'm trying to entice the people.
I'm enticed.
Yeah. Are you not enticed? Are you enticed, Dave?
It's too enticed.
There you go. That's like Count Orlok in The Sexual Chemistry with Ellen, because it's real, it's true, it's there.
Sexy Orlok.
They were way in love.
Yeah. Yeah. Early romance as well.
It was.
It's like Twilight, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's Twilight, but with better sexual chemistry.
That might be true.
No, that's certainly true. Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.